Welcome, everyone. I'm Karen von Hippel. I'm the director of RUSI, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here today. Many people are concerned all over the world as ISIL is being squeezed in Mosul and in Raqqa, in Iraq and Syria. Where might the many foreign fighters who aren't captured and killed, where might they go? And of course, Southeast Asia is a region of great concern. And so I know we'll have a lot of questions about that, not just about the returnees, but about some of the global affiliates that have been established, the so-called provinces, distant provinces of ISIL. So we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts on that. Just a bit of housekeeping. I think you'll speak for about 35 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A. We're following RUSI rules here today, which I think all of you know means that the public remarks are on the record and the Q&A is off the record. So I'd ask everyone please to respect that, and then we can have a more frank discussion in the Q&A period. I think most of you have the Honorable George Brandis's bio in front of you, but I think maybe just to mention that he has served in the Howard, Abbott, and Turnbull governments. He has been Attorney General and Vice President of the Executive Council since September 2013, and a member of the Liberal Party leadership group since May 2010. He was appointed leader of the government in the Senate in September 2015. So please join me in giving the Senator a warm welcome. The Attorney General.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Karen. And can I acknowledge my former parliamentary colleague, friend, and now the distinguished Australian High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, the Honourable Alexander Downer. It's a great pleasure for me to address the world's, what I'm told is the world's oldest strategic policy institute, the Royal United Services Institute, in this, I'm bound to say, very agreeable venue. Thank you so much for being available so early in the day and only shortly before Christmas to hear these remarks. Because what I want to do is to share with you Australia's perspective on thwarting ISIL's stated desire to establish a so-called Caliphate in Southeast Asia, and to acquaint you with some of the Australian responses to that threat, both in terms of domestic policy and in initiatives in collaboration with other nations. Terrorism is not a new phenomenon in my region, and while previous attacks have brought tragedy, those incidents have only strengthened our collective resolve to respond in opposition to those who seek to use fear and violence. Australian agencies have developed strong collaborative relationships with their respective justice and security agency counterparts in Southeast Asia and around the world. The main purpose of my visit to London and Paris this week is to further develop those relationships, so as to ensure that we are well equipped to respond to the evolving threat environment. Australia's efforts, along with its regional partners and its partners beyond the region, are focused on ensuring that there is no future for a so-called caliphate in the Southeast Asian region. There is no doubt that Southeast Asia will come under increasing pressure as foreign fighters, forced from Middle Eastern conflict zones, return home or disperse to new theatres. Before I cast my mind to the future, it's instructive to look at recent events. There's no doubt that the so-called caliphate in the Middle East is in swift decline. ISIL has not gained any new territory since June 2015. Australia, along with the United Kingdom as part of the coalition forces, continues to support the Iraqi government and the Iraqi army as they get closer to recapturing Mosul and liberating al-Raqqa. Government troops continue the dangerous work of retaking villages on the city's outskirts and liberating the citizens who have suffered under the heavy mantle of ISIL's barbarism. More than 1,000 ISIL terrorists have been killed and more than 100 arrested during the Mosul liberation operation alone. In the last 12 months, ISIL propaganda has diminished by more than 75% as it continues to lose supporters and finances. The coalition nations stand ready to help the people of Iraq and Syria as they reclaim their civilian lives. As an aside, I should mention that Australia has committed more than 220 million Australian dollars over the next 3 years for humanitarian assistance for Syria and its neighbours. But the current violence and the reach of the so-called Caliphate is not, of course, limited to the Middle East. This year, the Global Terrorism Index, an index prepared by the Australian think tank, the Institute for Peace and Economics, revealed a 650% increase in the number of terrorism-related incidents around the world. 2015 was the second deadliest year for terrorist incidents ever recorded, with more than 29,000 deaths, outstripped only by 2014, in which approximately 33,000 people died at the hands of terrorists. As well as the inestimable human suffering these events cause, there is a financial cost as well. It's been estimated that the global economic impact of terrorism reached $122 billion US dollars in 2015. These statistics show the true scale of the horror, and it knows no boundaries. Based on the advice of Australia's security agencies, on the 12th of September 2014, the Australian government announced the elevation of the National Terror Alert level from medium to high, the second highest category, which was the first time since the inception of in Australia of the threat level system that had been raised to that point. Over 2 years later, the threat level remains elevated, now described as probable under the new nomenclature which was adopted last year. This threat level means that credible intelligence, assessed by Australia's security agencies, indicates that individuals or groups continue to possess the intent and capability to conduct a terrorist attack within Australia. Indeed, since the 12th of September 2014, Australia has experienced 4 terror-related attacks, 3 of them lethal, 1 resulting in serious injury. And in the same period, our law enforcement and security agencies have disrupted another 11 imminent attack plots within Australia. While the number of Australians involved with ISIL in Syria and Iraq, and those supporting it from home, may be fewer than those from the United Kingdom, Australia is significantly overrepresented among ISIL's ranks on a per capita basis, which is especially remarkable when you consider our geographical distance from the conflict zone. Since 2012, around 200 Australians have travelled to Syria and Iraq to join the conflict. They are part of a cohort of over 40,000 foreign fighters, including around 7,000 from Western countries, most of them from Europe, who have travelled to the region to take up arms. Of these, approximately 110 Australians are currently fighting or engaged with terrorist groups in Syria and Iraq. We estimate that between 62 and 68 Australians have been killed as a direct result of their involvement in the conflict. At home in Australia, our law enforcement and intelligence agencies are operating in a significantly more challenging environment, which has required the rebalancing of resources and resetting of our risk tolerance thresholds. In the space of a year following the raising of the threat level, the priority caseload of ASIO, the Australian equivalent of MI5, more than doubled. Around 40 people have returned to Australia after travelling to the Syria-Iraq theatre and joining groups involved in the conflict. Some of those returnees remain of significant security concern. Around 190 Australian passports have been cancelled or refused for reasons relating to the Iraq-Syria conflict. Around 200 people in Australia are being investigated for providing support to individuals and groups in the Syria-Iraq conflict, including through funding and facilitation or seeking to travel. Since the 12th of September 2014, when we raised the threat level, 55 people have been charged with offences under the Australian Criminal Code as a result of 24 counter-terrorism operations carried out around Australia. So the threat in the Australian mainland is very real, and it is also very real for our near neighbours. As the Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull said on his return from the APEC meeting in Peru recently, Southeast Asia and its people are part of the fabric that shapes and defines the Australian community and our national identity. The reality is that Southeast Asia remains the region in which Australian interests are most likely to be impacted by terrorist attacks. It's estimated that between 500 and 1,000 Southeast Asian foreign fighters are currently engaged in Syria and Iraq. Reportedly more than 100 have died fighting for ISIL. Some will return to the Southeast Asian region with enhanced capabilities, a reinvigorated hatred of their nations, and a real experience in using violence to achieve their ends. Already we've seen several ISIL-linked Southeast Asian extremists involved in various attack plots in Indonesia, in Malaysia, and in the Philippines. The influence and support for ISIL has in particular increased in the southern Philippines, most particularly in Mindanao. Similarly, in Malaysia, ISIL launched an attack outside a bar in Kuala Lumpur using returnees from the Middle East conflict. In January this year, Jakarta was hit by a terrorist attack targeting foreigners, the first such anti-Western attack in Jakarta since 2009. That attack also targeted Indonesian police. The attack was encouraged by an Indonesian foreign fighter aligned with ISIL, facilitated by extremist prisoners in Indonesia, and carried out by ISIL-aligned extremists. In recent years, the Indonesian National Police have worked hard to arrest many terrorists, many of whom are serving significant sentences. In spite of this recent work, Indonesian extremist groups are being revitalised by the release of terrorists who have reached the end of their sentences, and terrorists behind bars who are nevertheless able to project influence beyond the boundaries of their cells. So Australia stands close by our neighbour, the most democratic Muslim-majority nation in the world, in confronting a threat to both of our countries. We have a strong bilateral relationship that has withstood the threat of terror before. In 2002, 88 Australians were killed in the Bali bombings when an Al-Qaeda-linked extremist group detonated 3 blasts. It remains the most deadly terrorist attack on Australians anywhere in the world. But 28 UK citizens were also killed in the Bali bombings, which makes them the 3rd deadliest attack affecting British citizens after the World Trade Centre and the 2005 London Underground attacks. We learned much in the following weeks and months as we worked with Indonesia to help the bereaved families and communities, nurse the injured back to health, and track down those responsible. The threats in Southeast Asia have stiffened our resolve and reminded us how closely Australia's national security is linked to that of Southeast Asia, most particularly Indonesia. So what is Australia doing to respond? We're committed to working together, as I've said, with our near neighbours to protect citizens throughout our region from terrorism, whether the threat comes from ISIL itself or regional extremist groups, including those affiliated with IS, Al-Qaeda or other terrorist organisations. We've worked collaboratively in partnership with our neighbours, Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand and Singapore, to combat the shared challenge of combating violent extremism. In this fight, cooperation remains a vital piece of the armoury. We must continue to talk and exchange information about emerging trends as foreign fighters inevitably disperse from the Middle East and try to return to their home countries or other places in the world, still intent on committing acts of violence. In August this year, I participated in an international meeting on counter-terrorism hosted by Indonesia in Bali, at which the United Kingdom was also represented. That meeting involved a frank exchange among ministers from across the region and beyond about how best to resist ISIL's attempts to mobilise our citizens. It built on discussions with my Indonesian counterparts in Sydney a few months earlier at a new ministerial forum we've established to further strengthen our bilateral national security cooperation. It's clear that there is considerable political will in the Southeast Asian region to tackle the influence of ISIL, and this is translating into greater operational and technical collaboration between our police and other law enforcement agencies. This year we adopted the ASEAN-Australia Joint Declaration for Cooperation to Combat International Terrorism at the inaugural ASEAN-Australia Summit. The renewed declaration acknowledges the changing landscape on international terrorism since the initial joint declaration of 2004, including the threat to the region from foreign terrorist fighters and online radicalisation. We also launched a regional compendium on counter-narratives, which contains practical advice for civil society organisations and practitioners to develop effective narratives that counter the approaches of ISIL, Al-Qaeda, Jemaah Islamiyah and other violent extremists operating in the region. Australia continues to work in close partnership with Indonesia on counter-terrorism legal issues, including an ongoing dialogue with Indonesian law and justice officials on our ability to use new technologies in terrorism and transnational crime investigations and prosecutions, as well as on the important issue of terrorism financing. We're working closely with law and justice officials across the region to enhance shared specialist expertise in complex terrorism prosecutions. And we're strengthening access to electronic and other evidence held overseas so that we can effectively prosecute terrorism, foreign incursions and terrorism-related crimes. Throughout the Southeast Asian region, legal officials must have access to this material in a timely and effective way, and my government is working with officials of nations across the region to facilitate this. Australia also co-chairs with Indonesia a working group on the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum that focuses on managing and rehabilitating terrorist prisoners. We're looking to enhance our work in the Philippines, where our priorities include management of terrorist offenders, countering the threat from kidnap for ransom, and supporting the peace process in Mindanao in areas that align with our counter-terrorism priorities. Only this week, Australia supported an influential group of stakeholders who attended the third iteration of the annual International CVE Research Conference in Jakarta. This will provide a platform for international researchers of CVE and network members to meet and share cutting-edge research, as well as a research agenda for the next year to help identify and bridge existing knowledge and research gaps. Success depends on a commitment to sharing experiences and interdisciplinary knowledge, and being open and frank with one another in sharing such knowledge and experience. Let me say a word about legislative reform which we have undertaken within Australia. In this unprecedented environment, the Australian government has introduced Australia's most significant program of national security law reform since 2001. We're committed to arming our frontline security agencies with the tools they need to keep our country safe, to match the evolving threat environment, including new technologies. In the last 2 years, the government has introduced and the Parliament has passed on a bipartisan basis no fewer than 8 tranches of legislation to strengthen the existing national security architecture. Just last week, the last sitting week of the year for the Australian Parliament, 2 of those national security bills were passed. The Criminal Code Amendment High Risk Terrorist Offenders Act created a new regime to enable a Supreme Court, on application by the Attorney-General, to make an order for the ongoing detention of a high-risk terrorist offender who is approaching the end of his or her custodial sentence and is about to be released back into the community. Such an order is of course unusual, although not unknown, in particular in the case of serious sexual offenders who continue to pose a high risk beyond the expiry of a custodial sentence. Such an order requires the judge to be satisfied to a high degree of probability and, on the basis of admissible evidence, that the offender poses an unacceptable risk of committing a serious terrorist offence were they to be released, and that there is no other less invasive measure to mitigate that risk. As well, the Counter-Terrorism Legislation Amendment Act No. 1 was also enacted. Sadly, recent experience has taught us that young people, children as young as 14, can pose a significant risk to national security through their involvement in planning and supporting and direct engagement in terrorist acts. We have seen that phenomenon in Australia recently. So we have reduced the age from 16 to 14 years at which a person with security concern can be the subject of a control order. The Act also introduces a new offence of advocating genocide to further respond to the impact on our community of people who preach hate and violence. In 2015, we amended Australia's Citizenship Act. This modernised a long-standing provision of Australian law to reflect the new reality. Now Australian citizenship can be stripped from dual citizens who are involved in terrorist conduct overseas or convicted of a terrorism offence in Australia. There is no doubt that all of these measures have had a real impact. Importantly, through passport cancellations, we're making it very difficult for people seeking to travel to become foreign fighters. We know that the threat of terrorism will come closer to home as ISIL's foreign fighters run away from a war they cannot and will not win. And we know that many will head to Southeast Asia, where ISIL sympathisers have already been attempting to establish new base camps. What does the future hold? We need to stay ahead of evolving trends in terrorism. The cast of actors, as we know, is more diffuse and more unstable and more changeable than ever. The rift between Al-Qaeda and ISIL increases the unpredictability of the threat. Now, the ISIL narrative has changed, encouraging would-be martyrs to seek glory in their homelands rather than calling them to the so-called Caliphate in the Middle East. The online terror compendium continues to grow, with reworked messaging and how-to manuals on how to wreak terror. So even though ISIL is suffering major reversals in its principal theatre of conflict, the narrative of a victimised so-called caliphate will still appeal to a committed and globally dispersed cohort. We know a single returned foreign fighter can cause havoc if still motivated by a vengeful hatred, whether of the West or of non-Western countries such as Indonesia, which nevertheless inspire the ire of Islamist extremists. And while there's much we have done to strengthen our counter-terrorism efforts, we need to consider how the threat may evolve in the immediate future. This may include responding to a dispersal of the threat, an increasing number of lone actors, and the return, as I've said, of foreign fighters to the region. As many of our senior and experienced law enforcement and security officials have said, we cannot arrest our way to success. We need to employ a range of measures to respond, and we need the cooperation of government, of industry, and of the broader community to ensure the threat of violent extremism does not jeopardise our way of life. That is a problem equally shared here in the United Kingdom and in my country. Let me mention some of those challenges and areas of focus. In July this year, our Prime Minister commissioned a report from the Counter-Terrorism Coordinator, an official within the Australian Government, to review the lessons we've learned from recent terrorist attacks overseas, and specifically the threat from lone actors. The review considered a number of issues, from protecting places of mass gathering through to the threat from lone actors and the potential relationship between mental health issues and violent radicalisation. The review confirmed that there are a diverse range of factors that could make someone vulnerable to radicalisation, And while we know the speed, process and factors that contribute to radicalisation are unique to each individual, we're also conscious that we need to better understand the nature of the relationship, in particular between mental illness and radicalisation. We also recognise that early signs of concerning behaviour are more likely to be noticed by a person's loved ones, their work colleagues, health professionals, teachers or members of their communities. As part of our efforts to focus on prevention and early intervention, we need to increase the awareness of radicalisation among such people so that they can assist to identify those who might be vulnerable. The best outcome for everyone is if we can intervene early and help people before they become a law enforcement and security concern. That's why the Prime Minister has asked that my colleagues, the Minister for Health and the Minister assisting the Prime Minister on counter-terrorism, work with the states and territories, peak bodies, international partners and the community to identify what more can be done while taking great care that we do not stigmatise some of the most vulnerable people in our communities. Prevention and early intervention are critical investments in our counter-terrorism strategy. At the heart of these efforts is supporting a strong and cohesive society that is resilient in the face of violent extremism. And I say that as an Australian minister, Australia being one of the most successful multicultural nations in the world. This has not been, by the way, the result of good luck, but deliberate design. The success of Australian multiculturalism has been built on the freedom to express diverse political, religious and ideological viewpoints in a peaceful way. To effectively counter violent extremism requires the efforts of governments, community groups, NGOs, industry and professional organisations and individuals to work collaboratively to a shared purpose. We need in particular to work with respected community leaders in the Australian Muslim communities to ensure that the members of their communities feel included within the broader Australian society. The focus of our CVE programs is targeted to reduce vulnerability to violent extremism and strengthen the Australian community's resilience so we can avoid using a law enforcement response wherever possible. A range of training and educational projects has been developed for families, schools, communities, institutions and frontline professionals to build awareness of radicalisation and provide advice on how to support at-risk individuals. And of course, changing the way an individual views the world, addressing their own individual grievances and changing their patterns of behaviour is a long and complex process. An investment in diversion and early intervention is critical to addressing the potential longer-term multi-generational security issues, especially in light of recent trends that have revealed an increasing number of young people and children vulnerable to radicalisation, which is why a key element of Australia's CVE efforts is the establishment of a national intervention program to bridge the gap between social cohesion policy and law enforcement responses, providing national funding and coordination support to states and territories to tailor and deliver local intervention activities. In addition to a range of tailored intervention programs to divert at-risk individuals from violent radicalisation, the Attorney-General's Department, which has responsibility for this area of policy in the Australian system, is also focused on strengthening our efforts to challenge terrorist propaganda, especially online. Past ideologues did not have the internet and social media to spread their messages. These tools are evolving and developing at an unprecedented rate that challenges our democratic and security institutions and the way that they have operated for 100 years or more. It is no surprise that more than 80% of teenagers between the ages of 14 and 17 consider the internet as a very important part of their lives. And research suggests that going online becomes a central activity for social interaction, education, knowledge gathering and exposure to new experiences. In addition to reducing the availability of terrorist propaganda online, social media companies are also partnering with individuals and community groups who have the desire but perhaps not the capacity or the technical skill to directly challenge the claims of terrorist groups. Recognising the unique challenges confronting their industry, companies such as Google, Facebook, Twitter, Yahoo and Microsoft have banded together to create a single entity to work with government, the Digital Industry Group Incorporated, or DIGI. Indeed, as recently as yesterday in Paris, I met with Nick Leader, the head of Google France, to discuss the ways in which Google is working with the French authorities to mitigate online terrorist narratives. The Australian government partnered with DIGI to successfully deliver a digital youth forum in Melbourne in October. Nearly 130 young people from around Australia came to learn how to become more effective digital citizens, especially speaking out against the messages of terrorism. This work to support alternative voices is occurring not just in Australia, of course, but across the world. Last year, Australia hosted the Regional Summit to Counter Violent Extremism, which led to a number of outcomes to support communities to challenge terrorist propaganda through capacity building programs, including the development of a regional compendium of counter-narratives. The compendium will assist governments and civil society groups in the region to challenge violent extremist narratives by outlining a step-by-step approach to building a counter-narrative and highlighting examples of effective messages from the region. The truth, as we all know, is the threat of terrorism is mutating and metastasising, and we need to stay in front of the challenge. That is why, in my country, we have introduced new laws to deal with the threat as it develops and evolves. As I've said before, security presents a paradox for democratic governments. Our agencies sometimes need to operate covertly, yet parliamentary democracy depends upon accountability and transparency. The reconciliation of those two imperatives is by no means easy. We need the cooperation of governments, industry and the community to ensure that the threat of violent extremism does not jeopardise our way of life. But the safety of our community must be our highest priority. The Australian government is determined to do everything in its power to ensure that Australians are kept safe from those who threaten our liberal and democratic way of life. The next stage in the struggle against ISIL, its surrogates and affiliates, beyond the destruction of the Caliphate, will present new and greater challenges. It will, as I've said, see the threat metastasise further and increasingly widen its focus beyond the Middle East, to Europe obviously, and to East Asia and Southeast Asia in particular. The Australian government continues to work closely with our British colleagues, as we both do with governments around the world, to defend our people from a lethal threat, which I am sorry to say will continue to define the national security environment and increasingly the domestic politics of our countries as well for our generation. Thank you.
Thank you.